We're here with Dr. Daniel Webster, who is the director of the Center for Gun Policy and Research. And he's joined us today as part of the Harm Reduction Conference. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Happy to do it.
Tell me about your research on these issues of harm reduction and addiction treatment, and especially how it relates back to drug policy.
So I have not myself focused on the treatment side of things. Most of my career I focused on the outcome of violence, homicides, non-fatal shootings. A lot of my work focused on policies that were directed one way or another to address people using guns against each other in ways that aren't good, obviously. But as I looked at the research, and I teach a class called Understanding and Preventing Violence, where we go in depth on a whole bunch of issues, including substance abuse, and more broadly, the underground gun and drug markets and how they function. And I felt that it may well be that some of our biggest impacts on gun violence have to do with drug laws as much as they have to do with gun laws. There was a broader literature that I was teaching about in my class for years that said policing seems to, that has focused enormous amount of resources on combating illegal drug activity, has really not been productive. It either has led to more violence, or in some cases, no effect whatsoever. Conversely, policies and policing strategies are focusing more narrowly on guns, illegal gun use, pretty consistently had the opposite response, lower gun violence. So I took the opportunity, and particularly it was in the year 2013, we were having a very big spike in violent crime. And there was a lot of discussion, what's behind this. And I wanted to take that opportunity to look at Baltimore data. We have data from other cities, other times that show what happens with different policing strategies on drugs. But even though our city is frankly known from programs like The Wire and others of all the activities and resources directed at illegal drugs, no one has actually done a study to say, what are we getting from that? So I carried out, we're completing that research now, and what we're finding is in many ways consistent with the other research that we found in other places. It appears as though after a big takedown of a unit that is selling drugs in a particular part of the city, you see a temporary period where gun violence goes up, maybe as much as 60% or more, and then it levels out to where it was before. We also find that the number of arrests for drugs, whether it's drug sales or drug possession, in a given month has almost no relationship to how much violence there's going to be in the subsequent month. So through a variety of ways that we're looking at the data, we see findings very consistent with other places, which is there's a temporary disruption in an illegal market. The way illegal markets function often is that those disruptions get settled with violence. Once those conflicts are settled, it goes back to where it was. So we've been doing the same thing over and over and over with a lot of resources, affecting a lot of lives in very, very harmful ways, and not getting the end result that we thought we wanted. We thought we were going to be able to address Baltimore's gun violence problem by policing drugs. We've gotten nowhere with that. That's what we're finding right now.
So in thinking about especially the violence side of this issue, and trying to connect it back to the harm reduction conference, what do you feel like are the largest and most important problems facing the city and the state when it comes to drug violence?
Well, Look, one of the things I'm doing is I've been heading a homicide review commission. And in that process, we look in depth into each of these cases. What was going on? What were the individuals, the suspects and the victims, their associates? And what we see is very common, same kind of patterns of substance abuse, lack of employment skills, so that they're, in essence, forced into illegitimate trade, unlawful trade. And when they get punished for that, we recycle them and they get back to doing precisely what they did before. So we need to take a completely different approach. We're spending a lot of resources, mostly warehousing people, rather than improving people's lives. So I think we're at an important juncture here where there's more research. I think there's more leadership. Politically, we're in a place, I think, where we're willing to think differently when it comes to drugs. And we won't find our way out of this overnight, but I'm encouraged by people coming together here to refocus our energies around what are those underlying problems? How do we treat addiction? How do we give people the skills they need to succeed so that they don't have to get into an incredibly dangerous occupation? Many people who sell drugs in Baltimore would love to have a safer occupation in which, when they go to work each day, they don't have to worry about whether they're going to come home or not. And that's the life, frankly, of a lot of people who are selling drugs in Baltimore. There may be some flash to that, but they would definitely prefer a safer lifestyle. And so we need to think about, how do we create communities, economies, schools that are going to give people opportunities? Because right now, everything we're seeing seems to be a product of underinvestment in people, other than a criminal justice system.
Okay. So, thinking about these issues more broadly, do you think that there is a policy solution that could come out of your work on how the disruption of illegal markets leads to violence, and how do you think that would be crystallized in a space like the Harm Reduction Conference?
So, one reason Baltimore police do what they do with respect to focusing a lot of their resources, arresting people and prosecuting people for violating drug laws, is that's what we've given them. We've given them laws, we've given them, frankly, resources. They get federal resources, to some degree state resources, that basically encourages them to use their resources in ways that the research suggests are completely unproductive. So now we allow rewards for law enforcement doing these big busts, taking people and assets, and they can use those assets for their paltry budgets that we keep cutting for police. And all the incentives that the laws create is driving how we police. So if we can have policies that say you can't use those resources, if you're arresting someone who's selling drugs and you confiscate their car and then you sell that car, right now that goes into the budget of the police department. Why don't we use those resources towards drug treatment, just as an example? The other way, and this is partly a cultural thing, but a professional culture, but prosecutors and police generally sort of earn their stripes, so to speak, by putting people behind bars for a very long time. So we need to get rid of mandatory minimums, things that just lead to people being behind bars for longer periods of time. we need to reward people for actually lowering violence. So I think if our state lawmakers get rid of mandatory minimums, restrict what law enforcement can do with the resources that they're getting from drug bust, and of course encourage treatment, redirect some of the funds that now are going to doing things that really aren't productive. They aren't making our city safer.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the resources that we're now funneling through some degree through state resources are not giving us the results. And oddly enough, it actually comes back on the state taxpayer,
Mm-hmm.
because what Baltimore police do, a city agency do here, how many people they arrest and go to jail for how many years, the state pays for that.
Mm-hmm.
So the state needs to create greater incentives for police to keep people out of prison, to
Mm-hmm.
do things that prevent crime, and part of what is driving crime is addiction. So I think that we can come up with policies that direct more resources towards treatment, prevention, job readiness, those kinds of things are going to be more productive than the law enforcement resources that have been, and the set of laws all rewarding policing practices that don't work.
Mm-hmm. So you touched on this issue a few times. Drugs and drug policy and addiction policy and harm reduction, and even the new third rail of American politics and gun control are all profoundly controversial topics. How do we ensure that the dialogue about these issues is informed by research evidence and maybe less driven by, as Sanders put it, yelling?
Right. So just on the gun control front, gun control means so many different things.
Sure.
So it's very controversial when you're talking about any kind of ban, okay? Mm-hmm. But most of the policies that really are politically feasible and will have the biggest impact, they're not so controversial. Mm-hmm. When you get 90% of the public that supports comprehensive background checks, just as an example, that's not controversial. Anything it's hard to think of many things that 90% of us agree on. Okay,
sure.
And so there's a lot of things that are designed for public safety to keep guns out of the wrong hands. It's not so controversial. We need to do all of those things. I think again, when it gets to drug policy, the more you can promote things that you have the evidence that say this will make us safer. Okay, people don't like their tax dollars being wasted. Mm-hmm. I think that we are building evidence to show that our current approach to drugs is wasting an enormous amount of resources. So that will appeal to some people. Other people, what will be appealing is they realize the lives we're destroying with our current system. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to sell reforms as investments in people. Mm-hmm. And I do think that we are entering a time of cultural change as we think about drugs, and also as we think about government. There's many people who are politically conservative who are very supportive of the kind of reforms that we need to occur, simply because they see, particularly the drug use related laws, as simply another thing that the government is telling an individual to do that is restricting their freedom, mm-hmm. that the government shouldn't be worried about. And people more on the progressive political side of this see the same problem but in a slightly different way. They see how it's been discriminatory and very harmful. So I do think we're entering into place when it comes to both drug policy and gun policy, where even though your worldviews might differ, you still come to the same place. You still come to the same place of you want effective policies that are going to lower violence and do it in a way that is least restrictive to individual liberties. And you can actually accomplish those two goals with smart gun and drug policies.
Dr. Webster, thank you so much for coming and talking
Sure.
to us today.